Welcome back. We've traveled through 60 million years of galactic history. We've watched ancient civilizations destroy themselves and break reality in the process. We've traced humanity's rise from Terra to the stars, seen our golden age of technology, and witnessed our fall into 5,000 years of isolation and horror. We left off at a moment of theft. The Chaos Gods reaching through the warp into the Emperor's laboratories, stealing the 20 infants who were meant to be humanity's future. The Primarchs, scattered across the galaxy before they'd even drawn their first breaths outside their gestation pods. Tonight, we watch what the Emperor does next. How he builds an empire from the wreckage of old night. How he finds his lost sons, one by one, and gives them armies to command. How 2 centuries of triumph, the Great Crusade, humanity's reconquest of the stars, leads to the single greatest betrayal in galactic history. This is the story of hope. And how hope was murdered by the son who loved his father most. So settle in. The night is long, and the fall from grace is always longer than the climb to glory. Let me tell you about the heresy. The infant Primarchs were torn from Terra by warp energies the Emperor could not contain. 20 pods, 20 newborns, each one containing genetic material worth more than entire worlds, scattered across the galaxy like seeds thrown into a storm. The Emperor must have stood in his ruined laboratory and felt something most would call despair. Years of work, his greatest creation, his sons, gone before he'd even seen them whole. But despair is a luxury that gods cannot afford. The Primarchs were lost, but they were not dead. The Emperor could feel them out there, somewhere in the vastness of space. Faint psychic signatures, candles in the darkness. They lived. They would grow. And eventually, he would find them. But in the meantime, humanity needed saving. And the Emperor still had the genetic templates, the knowledge of how the Primarchs were made. He could not recreate them. Each Primarch was unique, irreplaceable. But he could use their genetic material for another purpose. The Space Marine Legions. From each Primarch's genetic template, the Emperor created gene seed, organs that could be implanted into human adolescents, transforming them into super soldiers, not as powerful as the Primarchs themselves, but far beyond what Thunder Warriors had achieved. Stable, sustainable, capable of serving for centuries without degradation. The process was brutal. Most candidates died during the transformation, their bodies rejecting the gene seed, their organs failing as they tried to accommodate the changes. But those who survived, they became Astartes, Space Marines, Angels of Death, taller than normal humans by a foot or more, stronger, faster, with bones that could shrug off impacts that would shatter normal skeletons, multiple organs that made them nearly impossible to kill. Secondary heart, extra lungs, glands that allowed them to spit acid, go without sleep, survive in vacuum for short periods, and they were organized into legions, 20 of them. Each one using the gene seed derived from one of the lost Primarchs. Each one destined to eventually be reunited with the father they'd never met. But in those early years, the legions had no names, no identity beyond their number. The first legion, the fourth, the 17th. They were tools, weapons, functionally identical despite their different genetic sources. That would change when their Primarchs were found. But for now, they were simply the Emperor's army. And with them, and with what remained of the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor finished the unification of Terra. With Terra united, the Emperor turned his attention outward. The warp storms had calmed enough that travel within the Sol system was possible again. And there, on the red planet that had been isolated for 5,000 years, was Mars. The Mechanicum had survived Old Night. More than survived. They'd turned their desperate situation into a culture, a religion, a way of life. They controlled technology that Terra desperately needed. Shipyards, forge complexes, knowledge of advanced manufacturing that had been lost everywhere else. The Emperor needed Mars. Without their industrial base, his plans for reconquering the galaxy were impossible. But the Mechanicum were not simple subjects to be conquered. They had their own armies, their Skitarii legions, their Titan legions, walking god machines, cathedral-sized war engines that could level cities. They had the defensive advantage of an entire planet that was essentially one massive fortress. War was possible, but it would be costly. And the Emperor, for all his power, understood the value of diplomacy. So he traveled to Mars. To Olympus Mons, the massive shield volcano that housed the Mechanicum's central government. And there, in chambers where tech priests had worshipped the machine god for millennia, he made them an offer. He told them he was the Omnissiah, the machine messiah they'd been waiting for. It was brilliant, manipulative, and possibly true, depending on your perspective. The Emperor was the most advanced fusion of man and technology in the galaxy. His understanding of science and engineering surpassed even the Mechanicum's ancient knowledge. He could commune with machine spirits in ways that seemed miraculous. He could repair devices that the tech priests had given up on as irreparable. To the Mechanicum, who had spent 5,000 years worshipping technology and waiting for a savior who would restore humanity's lost knowledge, the Emperor seemed like prophecy made flesh. The Fabricator General of Mars, leader of the Mechanicum, knelt before the Emperor, not in submission, but in religious ecstasy. The Omnissia had come. The machine messiah walked among them. The Treaty of Olympus Mons was signed. Mars and Terra united. The Mechanicum would maintain their independence, their culture, their beliefs. They would worship the machine god and the Omnissiah, but they would provide their technology and their industrial might to the Emperor's cause. In exchange, the Emperor would protect them, grant them the right to search the galaxy for lost STC technology, give them monopoly over all technological research in his growing empire. It was a partnership, an alliance of equals, at least in theory. Terra provided the troops and the vision. Mars provided the weapons and the ships. Together, they would reconquer the galaxy. But before launching into the stars, the Emperor established the ideological foundation of his empire. What would later be called the Imperial Truth. It was radical for its time, revolutionary even. There are no gods, only humanity. The Emperor, despite his immense power, insisted he was not divine. He was simply a very advanced human. Psychic power was not magic, but a natural phenomenon that could be studied and understood. The warp was not supernatural, but another dimension of reality that followed its own laws. Religion was superstition. Faith was weakness. Reason and science were the only paths to salvation. This seems ironic, given what the Imperium would become in M42. Given that the Emperor is now worshipped as the God Emperor of mankind, that the ecclesiarchy commands more power than any other imperial institution, that faith is the foundation that holds the Imperium together. But in M30, the Emperor's logic was sound. He understood the warp. He knew that belief shaped reality in the immaterium, that gods could be created by worship, that the chaos gods fed on emotion and devotion. By denying the existence of gods, by promoting rationality over faith, the Emperor was trying to starve the chaos gods, weaken them, make humanity psychically invisible, or at least less appetizing. It was brilliant, and it was doomed to fail. Because humans need to believe in something. And when you tell people there are no gods, and then you show them a being of infinite power who can never die, who radiates golden light, who performs miracles, they're going to worship him whether he wants it or not. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In M30, the imperial truth was the law. Religion was forbidden. Science and reason would guide humanity back to greatness. And with Mars's shipyards building vessels at an unprecedented rate, with the Space Marine legions ready for deployment, with the warp storms calming enough to allow interstellar travel, the Great Crusade began. The first expeditionary fleets launched from Sol in the early decades of M30. Each one carried thousands of troops, entire cohorts of Space Marines. Support personnel, Imperial Army regiments, baseline humans who would garrison conquered worlds after the Astartes moved on. Their mission was threefold. First, find isolated human worlds and bring them into Imperial compliance, peacefully if possible, forcibly if necessary. Second, eliminate all Xenos threats. The Emperor's vision was humanity supreme in the galaxy. No aliens were to be trusted. No Xenos civilizations were to be allowed to flourish. Humanity alone would inherit the stars. Third, search for the lost Primarchs. Find the Emperor's sons wherever they'd landed. Bring them home. The early Crusade fleets moved cautiously. The galaxy was dangerous. Orc empires had grown during humanity's isolation. Minor Xenos species had claimed worlds that humans once inhabited. And the Aeldari, though diminished from their height, still commanded formidable power. But the Imperium had advantages. The Space Marines were unlike anything the galaxy had seen since the ancient Krork. Warriors who could not be intimidated, who fought with religious fervor despite the Imperial Truth's prohibition on religion, who saw themselves as the Emperor's angels, bringing enlightenment to the darkness. The Imperial army, drawn from Terra, and the first worlds to achieve compliance, numbered in the millions. They might not be as individually powerful as Space Marines, but they could hold territory, garrison worlds, provide the occupation forces necessary to actually control conquered systems. And the ships. Mars's forges worked without rest, building battleships, cruisers, escorts, transports. The Imperium's fleet grew with each passing year. Soon they numbered in the thousands, then tens of thousands. The Great Crusade was not a single, unified push, but hundreds of separate campaigns, each fleet operating semi-independently, finding worlds, bringing them into compliance, moving on to the next target. And slowly, systematically, the Imperium expanded. Within a decade, the systems surrounding Sol had been reclaimed. Within 2 decades, entire sectors were under Imperial control. Within 3 decades, the Crusade fleets had spread across a significant portion of the galaxy. And then, on a world called Chthoniya, orbiting a dying star, they found the first lost sun. Chthoniya was a hell, a mining world stripped to its mantle. Its surface nothing but tunnels and shaft mines going down hundreds of kilometers. Its population violent, desperate. Survival measured in successful raids and stolen resources. It should have been a simple compliance. But when the Imperial fleet arrived, they found something unexpected. The world's gang wars had stopped, united under a single leader, a warlord who had risen from nothing to command the loyalty of the entire planet. Charismatic, brilliant, capable of feats that no normal human should achieve. When he met the Emperor, recognition was instant. Father and son. The Emperor knew immediately this was Horus, the first Primarch to be found, though he had not been the first to be born. Horus had no memory of his time on Terra, only vague dreams. But when he looked at the Emperor, he knew. This was who he'd been waiting for. This was home. The Emperor renamed him Horus Lupercal and gave him command of the Qixistiith Legion, the Luna Wolves, who would later be renamed the Sons of Horus. The gene seed in the Luna Wolves was derived from Horus's own genetic template. They were, in a very real sense, his sons. Horus was everything the Emperor could have hoped for. A natural leader, strategic genius, diplomat and warrior both. He could inspire loyalty with a word, win battles through cunning rather than brute force. And he was fiercely devoted to the Emperor. Over the next decades, as more Primarchs were found, Horus remained the favored son, the one the Emperor turned to when the Crusade faced its greatest challenges, the one who seemed to embody everything the Imperial project represented. The other Primarchs, when they were found, looked to Horus as their big brother, their example of what a Primarch should be. If the Emperor made a mistake, it was this: showing too much favor to one son, making the others feel they had to earn what Horus received freely, creating a hierarchy when what was needed was equality. But that's speculation. Hindsight examining choices that seemed reasonable at the time. Because in those early decades of the Crusade, Horus seemed perfect. One by one, the lost Primarchs were discovered. Leman Russ on Fenris, a feral world of ice and monsters. Russ had been raised by wolves, became a barbarian king. When the Emperor found him, Russ challenged him to 3 contests: drinking, eating, and combat. The Emperor let Russ win the first 2, then defeated him in combat. Russ swore loyalty on the spot. He was given the Viaith Legion, the Space Wolves, warriors who shared his savage joy in battle. Ferrus Manus on Medusa, another brutal world, this one covered in volcanic wastelands. Ferrus had slain a great silver worm and forged his hands into living metal. He was a master of craftsmanship, brutal in warfare, but capable of creating beauty. The Xth Legion, the Iron Hands, became his. They shared his belief that flesh was weak, that enhancement through technology was the path to perfection. Fulgrim on Chemos, a world dying when he arrived. Through sheer force of will and organizational genius, Fulgrim saved it, made it prosperous, beautiful. He was a perfectionist. Everything he did had to be done with flawless technique. The Eard Legion, the Emperor's children, reflected his obsession with perfection. They were artists as much as warriors. Every battle choreographed to be aesthetically pleasing as well as effective. Vulcan on Nocturne, a volcanic hell world where survival required community and cooperation. Vulcan was massive, even by Primarch standards, gentle despite his size, compassionate. He believed in protecting the weak, in building rather than just destroying. The Viaith Legion, the Salamanders, shared his values. They were the most humane of the legions, the ones most likely to care about civilian casualties. Rogel Dorn on Inwit, an ice world where discipline and order were the only things preventing extinction. Dorn was stoic, unshakable, a master of defensive warfare and siegecraft. The 7th Legion, the Imperial Fists, became the Emperor's Praetorians, the defenders of the imperial palace, the ones who would never yield. Robute Guilleman on Macrage, a civilized world with functioning government. Guilleman had been raised by its rulers, taught statecraft and military theory. He was an administrator as much as a warrior. Practical, efficient. The 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, became the largest and most successful of all the legions under his leadership. They won more compliances than any other, liberated more worlds, set the standard for what a space marine should be, and so on. Each Primarch unique. Each one reflecting a different aspect of the Emperor's nature, and each one given a legion that shared their traits, their values, their approach to warfare. Not all the Primarchs were the same. Some were jovial and easy to get along with. Others were withdrawn, difficult, prone to darkness. Some embraced the imperial truth enthusiastically. Others maintained their own beliefs privately, going through the motions for the Emperor's sake. Tensions developed, rivalries. Some Primarchs got along naturally. Others barely tolerated each other's presence. Leman Russ and Lion L. Johnson nearly came to blows on multiple occasions. Perturabo felt constantly overshadowed by Rogel Dorn. Angron's barely contained rage made many of his brothers uncomfortable. But these were family squabbles. Nothing serious, nothing that couldn't be managed. Or so everyone thought. As the crusade progressed, a debate emerged among the legions. A fundamental disagreement about the use of psychic powers. The Emperor had trained psychers among the legions. Librarians, they were called. Space Marines with psychic abilities who used them to support their brothers in battle. They could foresee enemy movements, communicate across vast distances, shield their allies with psychic barriers, throw lightning or fire at enemies. Some Primarchs embraced their librarians, saw them as another tool, another advantage in warfare. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons, was a powerful psyker himself. His entire legion focused on psychic development. They believed understanding the warp was key to humanity's future. But other Primarchs were deeply uncomfortable with psychers. Leman Russ, Mortarion, and others saw the warp as inherently corrupting. They'd witnessed what happened when psychers lost control. They'd fought demons that came through human vessels. They wanted the librarians disbanded. Psychic powers banned entirely. The debate became so intense that the Emperor called a council. The Council of Nikaea. All the Primarchs were summoned to witness and participate. For days, they argued. Magnus defended psychic power passionately, explaining that understanding the warp was the only way to defeat it. That ignorance was more dangerous than knowledge. His opponents countered that humanity's curiosity about the warp was exactly what had doomed the Aeldari. That psychers were doorways waiting to be opened. That faith in human discipline was foolish when the warp could corrupt the strongest will. The Emperor listened, and then he made his judgment. He sided against Magnus. The Librarius was disbanded. All legions were to cease using psychic powers beyond what was absolutely necessary for navigation and communication. The study of the warp was forbidden. Psychers among the legions were to suppress their abilities or face censure. The ruling was called the Edict of Nikaea. Magnus was devastated. He felt betrayed. He'd built his entire legion around psychic development, trained them for decades in techniques that were now declared illegal. And the Emperor, his father, the being whose approval meant everything, had declared his life's work invalid. But Magnus was loyal. He obeyed. The 1,000 Sons ceased their overt study of the warp. They followed the edict's letter, if not quite its spirit. Looking back, this was one of the critical moments. One of the points where the heresy became inevitable. Not because the edict itself was wrong. Both sides had valid arguments, but because of how it made Magnus feel. Rejected. Misunderstood, alone. And when someone feels rejected by the thing they love most, they become vulnerable to anything that offers acceptance. The Chaos Gods were watching, and they knew how to use a wound like that. But Magnus wasn't the first son to be wounded by the Emperor's choices. That distinction belongs to Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the 70th Legion, the Word-Bearers found on Colchis, a world dominated by religious cults. Lorgar had been raised by priests, taught theology. He was a philosopher, a seeker of truth, and when he found the Emperor, he believed he'd found God. The Emperor told him otherwise, told him repeatedly, "There are no gods. Stop worshipping me. Focus on compliance. Bring worlds into the Imperium through reason, not faith." But Lorgar couldn't help himself. To him, the Emperor was divinity incarnate. How else could you explain his power, his wisdom, his vision? The imperial truth was fine as philosophy, but it was inadequate as religion. And Lorgar needed religion the way other men needed air. So he built temples on every world he conquered, established religions worshipping the Emperor as God, converted populations through faith rather than force. His compliances took longer than other legions because he insisted on proper conversion rather than simple submission. The Emperor grew frustrated. Lorgar's slow progress was noted, compared unfavorably to Guilliman's efficiency, to Horus's diplomatic brilliance, to the other Primarchs who conquered worlds and moved on without building elaborate religious structures. Finally, the Emperor had enough. He destroyed one of Lorgar's greatest works, the city of Monarchia, a perfect temple city on a world Lorgar had spent decades converting. The Emperor sent Guilliman and the Ultramarines to burn it, to force Lorgar and the entire Word-Bearers Legion to kneel in the ashes and acknowledge their failure. The humiliation was total, public, deliberate. The Emperor meant it as correction, as a lesson that would refocus Lorgar on the Crusade's true purpose. What it actually did was break something fundamental in Lorgar's faith. If the Emperor wasn't God, then what was? If the imperial truth denied the divine, but Lorgar had seen miracles, had felt the presence of something greater than himself, where was he supposed to direct that devotion? The answer came from one of his closest advisors. First Chaplain Erebus, a man who'd been quietly studying forbidden texts, who'd traveled to worlds where ancient religions still remembered the true gods, the ones that dwelt in the warp, the ones that answered prayers. Erebus showed Lorgar the truth. There were gods, just not the one Lorgar had been worshipping. The Chaos gods were real, powerful, and they offered everything the Emperor had denied: the chance to be a prophet, to spread a true faith, to build an empire not on reason, but on revelation. Lorgar converted. Not quickly, not easily. He wrestled with his conscience for years, but in the end, the wound the Emperor had inflicted was too deep, the need for something to believe in too strong. The word-bearers turned to chaos, but they did it quietly, secretly. They continued to fight in the Crusade, continued to bring worlds into compliance. But they also began preparing, identifying which legions might be vulnerable to corruption, which Primarchs carried wounds that could be exploited, and they found one who was perfect: Horus. As the Great Crusade neared its conclusion, as more and more of the galaxy came under Imperial control, the Emperor made a decision that shocked everyone. He was returning to Terra, leaving the Crusade, handing over command to another. He didn't explain why. The official reason was that he had critical research to complete, projects that required his personal attention, work that would benefit all humanity. The truth, known to only a few, was that the Emperor was trying to build something that would solve humanity's warp travel problem permanently. He'd discovered the Aeldari Webway, the network of tunnels through the warp that allowed instant travel without actually traveling through the immaterium. If he could replicate that technology, if he could create a human webway, then humanity would no longer be dependent on the Astronomicon, would no longer need to sacrifice psychers, would no longer risk warp storms and demon attacks. It was a project of incredible ambition, and it required the Emperor's full attention for decades, possibly centuries. So he needed someone to lead the crusade in his absence. He chose Horus, elevated him to the rank of Warmaster, gave him authority over all other Primarchs, made him, in effect, the second most powerful being in the Imperium. It was logical. Horus was the first found, the most experienced, the most diplomatic. He'd won more battles than any other Primarch. He had the respect of his brothers, even those who didn't particularly like him. But it created resentment. Some Primarchs felt they deserved the honor more. Pert Urabo, who'd won just as many compliances through brutal siege warfare. Lion L. Johnson, whose Dark Angels had been the first legion, the prototype for all others. Fulgrim, who'd achieved perfection in every campaign he led. They hid their resentment, swore loyalty to Horus, promised to serve. But the wound was there, waiting to be exploited. Shortly after being named Warmaster, Horus encountered a civilization unlike any the Crusade had found before. The Interrex, a human civilization that had survived Old Night and built something unique. They'd made peace with certain Xenos species, created a society based on cooperation rather than domination. They understood chaos, knew about the warp and its dangers. They'd developed cultural safeguards against corruption. By all rights, they should have been exterminated. The imperial truth forbade coexistence with Xenos. But Horus saw something valuable. A chance to prove that imperial compliance could be achieved through negotiation rather than conquest. Horus and his captains met with the Interrex leadership. Discussions went well. It seemed like a peaceful compliance might be possible, but Erebus was there. First chaplain of the Word-Bearers, traveling with Horus's fleet, observing, waiting for the perfect moment. The Interrex had a museum, a place where they kept artifacts too dangerous to destroy, but too important to forget. Among their collection was a weapon called the anathame, a sword that could kill even immortals, spiritually poisonous, chaos-touched. Erebus stole it. The theft destroyed any chance of peace with the Interrex. They blamed the Imperium, believed Horus had betrayed them. War erupted. The Luna Wolves, Horus's legion, were forced to destroy a civilization that might have been saved. And Erebus delivered the anatheme to agents who would use it exactly as the Chaos Gods intended. Weeks later, Horus and his fleet arrived at Davin, a world he'd brought into compliance decades before. But something had changed. The planet's governor had fallen to chaos worship, his warriors infected with demonic energies. It should have been a simple reconquest. But the governor, Yugan Temba, carried the anathame, and during the fighting, he managed to wound Horus with it, a small cut, barely deep enough to draw blood. Nothing that should threaten a Primarch, whose healing abilities could regenerate from injuries that would kill normal humans. But the anatheme's poison was not physical. It was spiritual, warp-born, and it began killing Horus from the inside. His captains panicked. Horus was dying. The wound wouldn't heal. His body, designed to be unkillable, was betraying him. Erebus was there, helpful, suggesting that perhaps the locals, who'd lived on Davin for generations, might have healing techniques unknown to imperial medicine. There was a temple, he said, a place where the old ways were practiced, where Horus might be saved. Desperate, Horus's closest advisors agreed. They took him to the Serpent Lodge, a temple dedicated to, officially, the local spirits. Actually, a cult of chaos undivided. A trap laid carefully over years, waiting for this exact moment. Horus's body was placed on an altar. Rituals were performed, and while his captains watched, believing they were witnessing primitive but effective healing, Horus's soul was pulled into the warp. In the Immaterium, Horus stood in a place that seemed like a vast amphitheater. Around him, visions played out, scenes from possible futures, carefully curated by the chaos gods to tell a story. He saw the Emperor enthroned in gold, worshipped as a god by trillions, the imperial truth abandoned, religion dominant, and the Space Marines, the Primarchs, forgotten, used, cast aside once their purpose was complete, just like the Thunder Warriors before them. He saw himself old, broken, used up in the Emperor's service, while the Emperor lived forever, worshipped and adored. He saw his brothers humiliated, killed, discarded. The Emperor's tools, nothing more. The visions were lies. Carefully crafted half-truths. The future they showed would only come to pass if Horus turned traitor. The imperial creed, the worship of the Emperor as god, would only emerge after Horus's rebellion forced the Imperium into desperate faith. But Horus didn't know that. In his fever dream, separated from his body, vulnerable and poisoned, he believed what he was shown. The Chaos Gods didn't reveal themselves, not directly. They worked through intermediaries, through the voices of what seemed like his own doubts and fears. They told him, "The Emperor has betrayed you, used you. He's building a human webway so he won't need the Astartes anymore. Once it's complete, you and your brothers will be discarded, just like the Thunder Warriors." They told him, "You could be something greater. You could rule, not as a servant, but as a god yourself. We can give you power the Emperor has denied you." They told him, "Your brothers feel the same way. They're waiting for someone to lead them, waiting for someone brave enough to stand against the tyrant." It was seduction, corruption, the most effective lies wrapped around kernels of truth. Horus was wounded, vulnerable, angry about being left behind, while the Emperor pursued secret projects, resentful of how some of his brothers had been treated, proud of his own achievements, and frustrated that the Emperor seemed to take them for granted. In that vulnerable moment, chaos found the crack in his soul and drove a wedge into it. Horus agreed. Not immediately, not with full understanding of what he was agreeing to, but he opened himself to their power, accepted their help. He woke. The wound was healed. His body restored. Better than before, in fact. Stronger. Filled with energies that made him feel invincible. His captains rejoiced. Their Warmaster was saved. The crusade could continue. They didn't see what had changed inside him, the corruption that had taken root, the voice that now whispered in his thoughts, the plans that began forming. Plans for rebellion, for war, for heresy. Horus returned to the crusade changed. But he was subtle about it. He didn't immediately declare rebellion, didn't announce his conversion to chaos. That would have been suicide. Instead, he began to talk with his brothers, carefully, feeling out their grievances, their wounds, the ways the Emperor had disappointed them. He spoke with Fulgrim, who felt his pursuit of perfection was never quite acknowledged, who wanted to be told just once that he'd achieved something flawless. He spoke with Angron, who'd never forgiven the Emperor for teleporting him away from his fellow gladiators on Nuceria. Angron's brothers and sisters in chains had died fighting for their freedom while he was taken to lead a legion. He wanted to die with them. The Emperor denied him even that. He spoke with Mortarion, who'd grown up on a poison world under the thumb of a tyrant, who'd almost defeated that tyrant single-handedly before the Emperor arrived and killed the monster in one stroke, robbing Mortarion of his vengeance, making him forever indebted for something he'd wanted to accomplish himself. He spoke with Perturabo, whose iron warriors won more compliances than anyone except the Ultramarines, but received none of the glory, whose mastery of siege warfare meant he was always given the hardest, bloodiest assignments. The meat grinder campaigns that destroyed other legions were just routine for Perturabo, and he was never thanked, never honored, just sent to the next hell. He spoke with Alfarius and Omegon, the secret twins who led the Alpha Legion, masters of intelligence and manipulation, who believed they knew more about the galaxy's true threats than the Emperor, who thought they were making the difficult choice, the necessary betrayal, for humanity's ultimate benefit. He spoke with Lorgar, who'd already turned, who'd been preparing this rebellion for years, who provided the theological justification, the religious framework that transformed betrayal into holy purpose. And he spoke with Magnus, though that conversation was more complicated. Magnus had never wanted to rebel. Even after the humiliation of Nikaea, even after the Emperor forbade everything the Thousand Suns stood for, Magnus remained loyal. But Magnus had kept studying the warp, in secret, carefully. He believed understanding chaos was the only way to defeat it. Ignorance was suicide. And through his studies, Magnus saw something terrible. He saw Horus's corruption, saw the trap that had been laid, saw the rebellion that was coming, saw that it would tear the Imperium apart. Magnus needed to warn the Emperor immediately, but he was on the far edge of the galaxy. His legion was isolated. There was no way to get a message to Terra in time through conventional means. So Magnus did what he thought was the only option. He used sorcery. Massive, unprecedented psychic force. He sent his consciousness screaming through the warp directly to Terra, bypassing all the safeguards, all the boundaries, all the carefully maintained barriers between realities. He burst into the Imperial Palace, into the Emperor's most secret laboratory, where the human webway was being built. And Magnus's psychic intrusion shattered it. The Webway Project, decades of work, the Emperor's secret masterpiece that would have freed humanity from dependence on warp travel, destroyed. The gate torn open, demons pouring through. The Emperor forced to abandon everything and hold the breach personally, or Terra itself would fall to continue demonic invasion. Magnus's warning was delivered, but the cost was catastrophic. The Emperor, standing in the ruins of his greatest work, feeling the pull of demons trying to force their way into reality, needing every ounce of his concentration to hold them back, looked at what his son had done and made a terrible decision. He couldn't leave the breach, couldn't even spare the attention to investigate Magnus's warning properly. The warning about Horus seemed impossible. Horus, his most loyal son, corrupted? It had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Magnus had fallen to corruption himself. That was the only explanation for this catastrophic breach of the webway. The Emperor sent Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to Prospero, Magnus's adopted homeworld where the Thousand Suns were based. The orders were to bring Magnus back to Terra in chains, to answer for his crimes, to face sanction for violating the Edict of Nikaea in the most spectacular way possible. But Horus intercepted those orders. He altered them. Just slightly. Just enough. Changed bring him back to execute him. Russ and his Space Wolves, who'd never liked Magnus, who'd always seen the Thousand Suns as too clever by half, too willing to flirt with dangers they didn't understand, accepted the modified orders without question. They attacked Prospero with the intent to kill. Magnus saw them coming. He could have evacuated, could have fled, could have defended his world with everything the Thousand Suns possessed. They were powerful psychers. The Space Wolves were savage but not invincible. But Magnus didn't defend, didn't flee, didn't resist. He believed he deserved this. He'd destroyed the Emperor's great work. He'd broken the one rule he'd been explicitly forbidden to break. If the Emperor had decided his punishment was death, then Magnus would accept it. He ordered his sons not to fight back, to accept their fate. The Thousand Suns watched in confusion and horror as the Space Wolves descended on Prospero, as the orbital bombardment began. As the city of Tizca, the beautiful capital filled with libraries and academies and wonder, started to burn. Some of the Thousand Suns couldn't accept it. They fought back, defended their homes, used their powers despite Magnus's orders. But it wasn't enough. The Space Wolves were brutal, efficient. They'd come to kill, and they did it well. The Thousand Suns, powerful as individuals but unprepared for this kind of total warfare, fell back, died, watched their world burn around them. Magnus, standing in his tower, watching his sons die because of his orders, finally broke. A demon whispered to him, not forcing, just offering. A way out. A way to save what remained of his legion. All he had to do was accept help, accept power, accept the gifts of the Chaos God who'd been courting the Thousand Suns for decades. Tzinch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate, the god of knowledge and sorcery and the secrets that corrupt. Magnus accepted. Reality tore open. The 1,000 suns, or what remained of them, were pulled through the warp to safety, to the planet of the sorcerers, a demon world in the eye of terror, where they would never have to hide their powers again, where they could study the warp without restraint. Magnus had fallen, not because he wanted to betray the Emperor, but because the Emperor's punishment, delivered through Russ's hands, had pushed him to a place where survival required damnation. The 1,000 Suns had joined the heresy, but they'd never wanted to. That's the tragedy of Magnus. He was loyal to the end, and his loyalty accomplished nothing except his own corruption. With several legions secretly turned to chaos, with plans laid and pieces moved into position, Horus was ready to begin the war. But he had a problem. Not all of his legion had turned. Many of the Luna Wolves, now renamed the Sons of Horus in honor of their Primarch, remained loyal to the Emperor. They'd followed Horus because they loved him, but they would never follow him into betrayal. The same was true of the other traitor legions, Fulgrim's Emperor's children, Mortarian's Death Guard, Angron's World Eaters. Each contained loyal elements who would reject chaos if they knew what was happening. Horus needed to purge these loyalists before the real war began. He ordered his forces to the Istvan system, officially to put down a rebellion on Istvan III, a world that had declared independence from the Imperium. The traitor legions assembled their forces, and Horus made sure that all the companies, all the squads, all the individual Marines who he suspected might remain loyal to the Emperor were assigned to the ground assault. They deployed to Istvan III, thousands of space marines, fighting to bring a rebellious world into compliance, doing their duty, trusting their Primarchs. And then from orbit, their own brothers fired. Life-eater virus bombs. Weapons so horrific they were banned except in the most extreme circumstances. They descended on Istvan III and released their payload. The virus spread across the planet's surface, killing everything. Every human, every animal, every plant, every microbe. All organic matter consumed, broken down, turned into a nutrient sludge that then ignited in massive firestorms. The loyalist space marines on the surface had no warning. Many died in the initial bombardment. But space marines are tough. Their biology allows them to survive things that would kill normal humans. Some of them survived the virus, adapted, filtered the toxins through redundant organs. They looked up from the ruins of Istvan III's cities and saw their own fleet bombarding them from orbit. They understood immediately. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't collateral damage. This was murder, fratricide, betrayal. And despite the overwhelming odds, despite knowing they'd been sent to die, despite the horror of what had just happened, they fought back. Captain Garo of the Death Guard, his armor breached, his body infected with the Life-Eater virus, managed to reach a ship. The frigate Eisenstein. He gathered other survivors. Space Marines from different legions who'd all been betrayed the same way. They fled Istvan III, jumped into the warp, desperate to reach Terra, to warn the Emperor that the Warmaster had turned traitor. Behind them, on Istvan III, the Loyalists who couldn't escape made their stand. Outnumbered, outgunned, but refusing to die quietly. They held out for months. Angron, frustrated by their resistance, deployed to the surface himself with his World Eaters. The fighting became brutal, close, personal. Brother against brother in the ruins of dead cities. Eventually, the Loyalists fell. But they'd accomplished something crucial. They'd delayed Horus's plans. And they'd gotten word out Garo and the Eisenstein were racing toward Terra, carrying the warning that would finally make the Emperor understand. His favorite son had betrayed him. When news of the Istvan III atrocity reached Terra, when the surviving Loyalists delivered their warning, the Emperor responded immediately. He sent 7 legions to Istvan V, where Horus had relocated his forces. 7 full legions, nearly a third of the Astartes that existed, more than enough to destroy even the Warmaster's forces. The Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, the Salamanders under Vulcan, the Raven Guard under Corvus Corax. These 3 would deploy first. They were the first wave, the hammer that would smash Horus's rebellion before it could truly begin. Following behind them, ready to deploy as reinforcements, were 4 more legions. The Iron Warriors under Perturabo, the Night Lords under Conrad Kurze, the Word Bearers under Lorgar, the Alpha Legion under Alpharius, 7 legions. Horus had 4. The math was simple. The rebellion would be crushed. But 4 of those 7 legions had already turned. Perturabo, Kurze, Lorgar, and Alpharius were all part of Horus's conspiracy. They'd positioned themselves as reinforcements deliberately, waiting for the perfect moment. The first wave deployed to Istvan V. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard descended in drop pods and landing craft. They hit the surface and immediately engaged Horus's forces. The fighting was brutal. The traitors had fortified their positions, but the Loyalists were pushing them back. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, pushed hardest of all. He was enraged. Fulgrim had tried to turn him, had offered him a place in the rebellion. Ferrus had refused and nearly killed Fulgrim for the suggestion. Now Ferrus saw the Emperor's children on the battlefield and charged. He would kill Fulgrim personally. End this betrayal with his own hands. The 2 Primarchs met in single combat. Brothers who had been close, who had forged weapons together, who had shared philosophies about perfection and craftsmanship. They fought with everything they had. And Fulgrim, empowered by chaos, wielding a demon sword called the Blade of Laer, killed Ferrus Manus, beheaded him. The first Primarch to die in the heresy, his head taken as a trophy. The Iron Hands saw their Primarch fall and went berserk with rage. They pushed forward even harder, reckless, desperate to avenge their father. And that's when the trap sprang. The second wave deployed. The reinforcements. The Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word Bearers, and Alpha Legion descended behind the Loyalist forces and opened fire on them. The Loyalists found themselves trapped between two armies of traitors, surrounded, outnumbered, betrayed not once, but twice in the same day. The drop site massacre was total. The Iron Hands, already berserk from losing their Primarch, fought to the last Marine. Almost none survived. The Salamanders scattered, trying to escape. Vulcan disappeared in the chaos. The Raven Guard, masters of stealth and guerrilla warfare, managed to extract some of their forces, but they left thousands dead on Istvan V's black sand. Corvus Corax, Primarch of the Raven Guard, barely escaped. He would spend the rest of the heresy rebuilding his legion from the handful of survivors. The Salamanders were shattered, their Primarch missing, their numbers decimated. 3 legions destroyed in a single day, and Horus now controlled Istvan V completely, his rebellion secured, his forces ready to march on Terra itself. The galaxy was burning, and it was only going to get worse. Let's pause and clarify. Because the galaxy is splitting in 2, and it's important to understand who fell and who remained. The traitor legions, sons of Horus, formerly Luna Wolves, Horus's own, fell because their Primarch did. Many didn't want to betray, but their loyalty to Horus exceeded their loyalty to the Emperor. Emperor's children, Fulgrim's perfectionists, fell to Slaanesh. Their pursuit of perfection became pursuit of excess. Sensation. Experience beyond mortal limits. Iron Warriors, Perturabo's siege masters, fell from bitterness, from being used as disposable troops, from never receiving the honor they deserved. Chaos offered appreciation. Night Lords, Conrad Kurz's terror troops, fell because they'd never really been loyal. Kurze was a monster who'd used fear as a weapon. Chaos just gave him permission to be what he'd always been. World Eaters, Angron's Berserkers, fell to Khorne. Angron had been slowly dying from cybernetic implants that made him feel only rage. Khorne offered him eternity of violence. His legion followed because they loved their broken father. Death Guard, Mortarian's resilient infantry, fell to Nurgle, trapped in the warp, infected with a plague that wouldn't kill, but wouldn't stop hurting. Nurgle offered peace, acceptance, an end to suffering through embracing decay. 1,000 Suns, Magnus's sorcerers, fell to Tzeentch, pushed into it by the Emperor's condemnation, by Prospero's burning, by having nowhere else to go. Word-bearers, Lorgar's zealots, fell first, planted the seeds that corrupted the others, fell because the Emperor rejected their faith. Chaos offered something to believe in. Alpha Legion, Alfarius and Omegon's spies, fell for complicated reasons, possibly because they believed betraying the Emperor was the only way to save humanity, possibly because they were corrupted, possibly both. With the Alpha Legion, you never quite know. 9 legions turned. Well, 9.5, if you count what happened to the 1,000 Suns. Against them stood 9 loyal legions, and the Imperium's conventional military forces, and the Emperor himself. But the traitors had the advantage of surprise, of striking first, of the sheer psychic shock of betrayal. Brothers killing brothers, sons attacking their father. The unthinkable made real. The Shadow Crusade. While Horus prepared his march on Terra, other traitor Primarchs pursued their own agendas. Lorgar and Angron led a campaign called the Shadow Crusade. They swept through Imperial space like a plague, not just conquering worlds, but corrupting them, turning them to chaos. Lorgar preached, converted populations wholesale, established chaos cults, created infrastructure for worship of the dark gods. He was building a religious empire within the Imperium. Angron just killed. His world eaters descended on world after world, butchering populations for the glory of Horn. 8 cities, 8 massacres, a ritual sacrifice on a galactic scale. And at the end of it, Angron underwent apotheosis, ascended to demonhood, became a demon prince of Khorne. He was no longer really a Primarch, no longer physical in the way he'd been. He could be banished, but not truly killed. He'd become something of the warp, eternal, damned. Angron was the first Primarch to take this step, but he wouldn't be the last. Guilliman and the Ultramarines, the largest and most successful of all the legions, were positioned to be a decisive force against the rebellion. If they could reach Terra in time, they might turn the tide. Lorgar ensured they couldn't. He sent word to Guilliman, summoned him to the world of Kalth for what was supposed to be a strategic meeting. Guilliman came with a significant portion of his legion, trusting his brother, ready to coordinate their response to Horus's betrayal. Lorgar's word-bearers attacked without warning. The Battle of Kalth was devastating. The Ultramarines were ambushed in their own system. their fleet crippled, their ground forces engaged by traitors they'd thought were allies. Guilliman survived. His legion survived. But they were crippled. Trapped in Ultramar, fighting word-bearers and the demonic incursions that followed. They would eventually break out, would eventually rejoin the war. But not in time for Terra, not when it mattered most. Meanwhile, on Terra itself, the Emperor couldn't leave. The webway breach that Magnus had created still poured demons into the Imperial Palace. The Emperor stood in the throne room that would one day bear his name. The Golden Throne, holding back the tide through sheer psychic force. Unable to lead his forces personally. Unable to do anything except prevent Terra's immediate fall to chaos. He summoned Malkador the Sigillite, his oldest friend, his most trusted advisor. Together, they coordinated the Imperium's defense, but they were essentially prisoners in the palace, powerful beyond measure, but unable to leave. The stage was set. The traitors were coming. The loyalists were scattered, and Terra itself was under siege from within. It took years for Horus to reach Terra. Not because of distance, but because the loyalist legions fought every step of the way. The White Scars, the Imperial Fists, the Blood Angels, the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves, once they'd finished with Prospero and understood their mistake. The surviving Salamanders and Raven Guard, the fragments of the Iron Hands seeking vengeance for their Primarch. They contested every world, every system, slowing the traitors, bleeding them, buying time for Terra to prepare its defenses. Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, was recalled to Terra. Given command of the entire planetary defense, he'd built fortifications across the galaxy. Now he would build the greatest fortress the Imperium had ever seen. Terra became a citadel. Every approach fortified. Orbital plates turned into weapons platforms. The palace itself layered with defenses that would make it effectively unassailable. In theory. But Dorn knew, deep in his strategic mind, that no fortress could hold forever against the force Horus was bringing. The siege would come down to whether the loyalist legions could reach Terra in time, whether the traitors could be defeated before their numbers became overwhelming. It would be close. Late M31. The exact date disputed. Lost in the chaos of those years. Horus's fleet arrived in the Sol system. Hundreds of ships carrying 9 traitor legions, billions of cultists and corrupted Imperial army regiments, titans, demon engines, war machines that should not exist. The space around Terra became a battlefield. Fleets clashed in the void. Ships burned, died, fell into Terra's gravity well. Trailing fire. The traitors had numbers, but the loyalists had the advantage of defensive positions, orbital fortresses, gun platforms. Every approach to Terra was a death trap. The battle in space raged for weeks. neither side gaining decisive advantage. The traitors couldn't break through to land forces on Terra's surface in sufficient numbers. The loyalists couldn't drive them away. Stalemate. Until Horus made his gambit. He lowered his flagship's shields. The vengeful spirit, his command vessel, dropped its void shields and broadcasted a message directly to the Imperial Palace. A challenge. Father and son. Come face me. End this between us. No more fleets dying. No more of your precious Imperium burning. Just you and me. It was obvious bait. An obvious trap. But the Emperor understood that time was not on his side. The longer the siege continued, the more likely traitors would break through. The more likely Terra itself would fall. And perhaps, deep in whatever the Emperor felt that might be called hope, he believed he could turn Horus back, could somehow reach his favorite son and make him understand. Redemption. Salvation. Return. Or maybe he was just tired. Tired of holding back demons. Tired of watching his dream burn. Tired of being worshipped as a god he'd never claimed to be. He prepared to teleport to the vengeful spirit, taking with him his finest warriors. Dorn. Sanguinius. Primarch of the Blood Angels, who'd just arrived with his legion. The Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. A handful of others. They would board the traitor flagship, fight their way to Horus, and the Emperor would do what had to be done. The interior of the vengeful spirit had changed. Reality was thin there. The warp bleeding through, corridors that bent in impossible geometries, demons manifesting and vanishing. Gravity itself negotiable. The Emperor's strike team became separated, lost in the ship's twisted architecture, forced to fight their way through individually rather than as a coordinated force. Sanguinius reached Horus first. The Blood Angel's Primarch was beautiful, the most physically perfect of all the Primarchs. Wings like an angel, which had made some of his brothers mock him. But Sanguinius had proven himself in battle after battle. He was beloved by his legion, respected by his brothers. And he'd foreseen this moment. His psychic gifts showed him the future, showed him his own death, showed him standing before Horus, knowing he couldn't win, but knowing he had to try. They'd been close once, Horus and Sanguinius, brothers in truth as well as genetics. They'd fought campaigns together, celebrated victories together. Horus had named Sanguinius as the Primarch he'd most want by his side if he could choose only one. Sanguinius stood in the throne room of the vengeful spirit and looked at what his brother had become. Horus wasn't Horus anymore. The Chaos Gods had empowered him, made him into something beyond a Primarch. His body swollen with warp energies, his eyes reflecting the depths of the immaterium, his presence a weight that pressed down on reality itself. Sanguinius tried one last time to reach him, to find the brother beneath the corruption. He spoke of loyalty, of brotherhood, of the Imperium they'd built together. Horus laughed and offered Sanguinius a place at his side. "Join me. We could rule the galaxy. Father always preferred you anyway, the true favorite. Take your rightful place." Sanguinius refused, raised his weapon, and attacked. The fight was desperate, brutal. Sanguinius fought with everything he had. His blade drew blood. His strength, immense even by Primarch standards, allowed him to hurt Horus, to crack the armor, to prove that the Warmaster wasn't invincible. But it wasn't enough. Horus was empowered by all 4 Chaos gods. Khorne granted him strength. Nurgle granted him resilience. Tzeentch granted him prescience. Slaanesh granted him speed. Sanguinius died, his back broken across Horus's knee, his body cast aside like refuse. But he'd accomplished something crucial. He'd wounded Horus, weakened him, shown that for all his power, he could still bleed. When the Emperor arrived moments later, Horus was weakened, tired, vulnerable in ways he wouldn't have been if he'd faced the Emperor fresh. Maybe that's why Sanguinius had to go first. Maybe the Emperor's psychic foresight had shown him the same vision Sanguinius saw. Maybe the angel's death was necessary for the father to have any chance at all. The Emperor stood in the throne room of the vengeful spirit and looked at his most beloved son. Horus stood over Sanguinius's corpse, not triumphant, not joyful, just there, waiting. What passed between them in those first moments, we don't know. Did they speak? Did the Emperor try one last time to reach the son he'd loved? Did Horus explain himself? Justify his betrayal? Or did they simply acknowledge that it was too late for words? The fight began. 2 beings of immense power. The Emperor, humanity's pinnacle. Horus, empowered by gods. Reality itself strained under the forces they unleashed. Psychic lightning, warp fire, physical blows that could shatter continents. They fought not just in the material realm, but in the immaterium, their consciousnesses clashing across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Emperor held back. He was trying not to kill, trying to wound, to disable, to somehow save the son who'd meant so much to him. Horus had no such limitations. He fought to kill, to destroy the tyrant who'd used him, to prove that he was superior, that he'd been right to rebel. The Emperor was losing. A custodes, one of the Emperor's golden guardians, burst into the throne room, saw his master in danger, charged to help despite knowing it was hopeless. What could a custodes do against beings like this? Horus killed him without looking. A gesture, a thought. The custodes unmade, his atoms scattered. And the Emperor saw, in that casual murder, what his son had truly become. There was nothing left of Horus, The corruption was complete, total. The son he'd loved was gone. What remained was a tool of chaos, a puppet wearing his son's face. The Emperor stopped holding back. He unleashed his full power, psychic force beyond comprehension. The lightning of his wrath focused into a single, devastating strike aimed directly at Horus's soul. Horus tried to defend. The Chaos Gods poured their power into him, trying to preserve their champion. But the Emperor's attack pierced through all of it, burned through the layers of chaos, reached the core of what Horus had become, and destroyed it. Not just the body, the soul. The very essence of Horus Lupercal was obliterated, burned away so completely that even the Chaos Gods couldn't resurrect him. His spirit scattered, his name cursed. But the effort cost the Emperor everything. Horus, in his final moments, had struck back. His powered claw, the talon of Horus, had torn through the Emperor's armor, through his flesh, through organs that had kept him alive for 40,000 years. The Emperor fell, dying, his power flickering like a candle in the wind. Rogel Dorn found him there, the Emperor lying broken in the ruins of the Vengeful Spirit's throne room. Horus's body nearby, charred beyond recognition. Dorn carried his father back to Terra, back to the Imperial Palace, back to the throne room where the Emperor had been holding back the demonic tide from Magnus's breach. The Emperor couldn't speak, couldn't move. But through psychic communication, he gave Malcador and Dorn instructions. The Golden Throne had been built to interface with the human webway. It was a psychic amplifier, a life support system, a prison. Place me there, sustain me. I can hold the breach closed. I can maintain the Astronomicon. I can still guide humanity. But I cannot heal, cannot leave, cannot die. Malcador understood. The Emperor would have to sit on that throne forever, or until the webway breach could be properly sealed, or until some solution could be found. Malcador volunteered to take the throne temporarily while the Emperor was prepared, to hold back the demons while the tech priests built the life support systems that would keep the Emperor's body functioning. Malcador lasted only hours. The strain killed him. His body withered to dust. His soul consumed in the effort. The Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne. The machines activated. The psychic field established. And there he sits. 10,000 years later, still holding back the demonic tide, still powering the Astronomicon, still keeping the Imperium alive through sheer force of will, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to die. The greatest tragedy in a galaxy full of tragedies. With Horus dead, the rebellion collapsed. Not immediately, not completely. But the traitor legions, leaderless, without the Warmaster's coordinating genius, fractured. Some fled into the eye of terror. Some continued fighting, launching desperate attacks. knowing they'd lost but refusing to surrender. Some fragmented entirely, their warbands scattering across the galaxy to wage personal vendettas. The loyalist Primarchs pursued them, Guilliman finally free from Ultramar. The Lion arriving too late to help at Terra, but in time to hunt the fleeing traitors. The Khan, Dorn, Corax, Vulcan, who'd somehow survived the drop site massacre. They spent years hunting down the traitors, destroying their strongholds, purging their influence from Imperial space. They call this period the Scouring, the Cleansing, the Great Purge that followed the Heresy. Trillions died, not in the initial fighting, but in the aftermath. Worlds that had welcomed the traitors were subjected to exterminatus. Populations suspected of chaos worship were purged. The paranoia was total. Better to kill 1 million innocents than risk one chaos cult surviving. The traitor Primarchs escaped, mostly. They fled to the Eye of Terror, where the warp and reality mixed, where they could build daemon worlds and continue their rebellion forever. Fulgrim ascended to daemonhood, became a daemon prince of Slaanesh, no longer bound to physical form. Mortarion ascended, became Nurgle's champion. Magnus had already ascended after Prospero. Lorgar retreated into meditation, studying the nature of chaos, spreading the faith. Perturabo built fortress worlds in the Eye, preparing for the long war that would follow. Angron was already a demon. The Alpha Legion scattered, each cell operating independently, pursuing agendas known only to themselves. The Sons of Horus renamed themselves the Black Legion under the command of Abaddon the Despoiler, who swore he would finish what Horus started. 13 Black Crusades. 13 attempts to take Terra. All failures, until the 13th would finally succeed in breaking the galaxy itself. The loyal Primarchs faced a difficult question. How do you prevent this from ever happening again? How do you ensure that if another Primarch falls, they can't take an entire legion with them? Guilliman proposed the answer. The Codex Astartes, a massive tome detailing Space Marine organization, tactics, traditions, and most importantly, limitations. The legions would be broken up, divided into chapters of approximately 1,000 Marines. Each chapter independent, each with its own command structure, its own home world, its own traditions. This way, if a chapter fell to chaos, it would only be 1,000 Marines, not tens of thousands, not a legion. The damage would be containable. Some Primarchs agreed readily. Corax saw the wisdom immediately. The Khan understood the necessity. Others resisted. Dorn fought Guilliman on it. He saw it as punishment for loyalists, treating them like they couldn't be trusted. The Lion was ambivalent. His dark angels had secrets they couldn't share. Dividing the Legion would make those secrets harder to keep. Eventually, most complied. The second founding created hundreds of new chapters from the original legions. The Ultramarines alone created more than 20 successor chapters. The Space Wolves barely complied. Dorne's imperial fists split reluctantly. Some chapters maintained close ties to their successors. Others became completely independent. The age of the legions was over. The age of chapters had begun. In the centuries after the heresy, the remaining loyal Primarchs gradually disappeared. Corax entered the Eye of Terror alone, hunting the word-bearers, seeking vengeance for Istvan. He was never seen again. The Khan pursued Dark Eldar raiders into the webway. His last transmission said he'd found something. Then silence. Vulcan vanished on a mission to locate artifacts he'd created. Whether he's dead or simply hidden, no one knows. Dorne died. Maybe. His body was never recovered. Only his hand, still clutching his sword. The Lion returned to Caliban, the Dark Angel's home world. Found it in rebellion. His second-in-command, Luther, had fallen to chaos. They fought. The planet was destroyed. The Lion disappeared. Some say he sleeps in a hidden chamber deep within the Dark Angel's fortress monastery, waiting to be awakened when the Imperium needs him most. Guilliman was poisoned by Fulgrim, a demon blade that put him in stasis. Not quite dead, not quite alive. He would remain that way for 10,000 years, until M42. Only one loyal Primarch is confirmed alive and active. Leman Russ. He left on a quest into the Eye of Terror, promising to return for the Wolf Time, the final battle. He hasn't been seen in 10,000 years. The Imperium lost its Primarchs. All of them. The Emperor's sons, dead or missing or worse. For 10,000 years, humanity would govern itself without their guiding hands, without their superhuman wisdom, without their presence, and it would suffer for that absence. So, we've watched the greatest tragedy in the history of the galaxy unfold. From the scattering of the Primarchs, through the glorious centuries of the Great Crusade to the moment when everything broke. When a son looked at his father and saw a tyrant instead of a savior. When brothers turned on brothers and made the galaxy burn. When the Imperium's brightest future became its darkest nightmare. The heresy defined everything that followed, every suspicion, every paranoia, every brutal excess of the Imperium in M42 traces back to that betrayal. The Inquisition exists because of the heresy. Prohibition on technological innovation exists because the rebels used technology to kill loyalists. The worship of the Emperor as God exists because humanity needed something to believe in after the imperial truth proved inadequate. The scars never healed. 10,000 years later, they're still fresh. The galaxy is still paying for what Horus did, what Lorgar planted, what Magnus accidentally enabled, what the Chaos Gods orchestrated. When we return for Part 4, we'll trace those 10,000 years. We'll see how the Imperium, gutted and broken, managed to survive. How it became the grinding, brutal, faith-driven nightmare that defines the 42nd millennium. We'll watch as hope slowly died, as pragmatism became cruelty, as the dream of a rational continue empire became a theocratic nightmare. We'll see the wars that never ended, the crusades that reclaimed nothing, the internal conflicts that tore the Imperium apart from within, even as external enemies pressed from all sides. We'll understand how an empire that was supposed to bring enlightenment became the most oppressive regime in galactic history. How the Emperor's atheist vision transformed into a religion so vast, so consuming, that it swallowed everything that made humanity human. 10,000 years of slow collapse, of maintaining rather than building, of surviving rather than thriving, of grinding forward not toward victory, but simply toward another day of existence. This is the age of the Imperium, the long midnight that stretches from M32 to M41, the era where the Imperium becomes exactly what the Emperor tried to prevent, where every day is worse than the one before, but better than any that will follow. And at the end of it all, in M42, when the galaxy splits in half and darkness claims entire sectors, we'll see whether any hope remains, whether Guilliman's return is salvation or simply prolongs the inevitable, whether humanity can survive its own decay. But that's for next time. For now, let this settle. The heresy, the siege, the death of Horus and the eternal imprisonment of the Emperor, the scouring and the disappearance of the Primarchs, the second founding and the beginning of the long decline. Remember that everything we've discussed tonight, all the betrayals, all the battles, all the brother-killing and world-burning, happened because of love. Because Horus loved his father so much that he couldn't bear to feel unappreciated. Because Lorgar loved the divine so deeply that rejection destroyed him. Because Magnus loved knowledge enough to break reality trying to share it. The road to hell isn't paved with evil intentions. It's paved with love that curdled into bitterness, with loyalty that demanded too much, with faith that found the wrong gods to worship. The heresy was a tragedy. Not because villains destroyed heroes, but because heroes destroyed each other. Because the brightest hope the galaxy had ever seen consumed itself in the fires of its own contradictions. And from those ashes rose an empire that would spend 10,000 years mourning what it had lost, while becoming something far worse than anything it had fought against. Thank you for staying with me through this long night of betrayal, through the golden age of the Great Crusade and its collapse into fratricide, through the battles that shook the galaxy and the choices that damned it. Sleep now, if you can. Dream of what might have been if Horus had never been wounded on Davin, if Erebus had never stolen the anatheme, if the Emperor had shown just a little more love to the sons who needed it most. Dream of a galaxy where the heresy never happened, where the human webway was completed, where the Imperium became the rational, secular paradise the Emperor envisioned. Then wake and remember that we live in the timeline where everything went wrong, where the best intentions led to the worst outcomes, where hope died on the vengeful spirit, and what emerged from its corpse was 10,000 years of grinding darkness. Until Part 4. May you rest easier than the Emperor on his golden throne. May your dreams be gentler than the memories of brothers who killed each other. May you wake grateful that you live in a universe where such horrors are only fiction. Though sometimes, late at night, when you consider what humanity might do to itself, given enough time and enough hubris, you might wonder if it's really fiction after all. The Emperor protects, or so we must believe. Because if he doesn't, then 10,000 years of sacrifice have been for nothing, and the darkness has already won. If you're still here, maybe start the next episode, or just let the quiet take you. And if you've already drifted off, that's all right. Good night, traveler. Sleep well beneath the stars.